Recording. There we go.
All right, everyone. So welcome to our Learn Your English webinar on text-based language teaching. It's nice to see that many of you have returned from previous workshops. Today, and basically we're going to look at the value of texts. But before we do that, let's just go through, because some of us are members, but some of us are not. So basically we are Learn Your English. We are an online educational startup, and we are advancing continuous professional development and also helping with learner education through both our teacher membership and student memberships. And when we design our courses and we're designing our websites, we always try to factor in these three facets: the theory, our own personal practical knowledge, and of course the most up-to-date research in the field. And really our programs and our professional development opportunities kind of appear in the nexus of where these three elements come together. And as I mentioned earlier, we offer memberships, and really the value of the membership is that we're trying to create communities, both teacher and professional development communities, but also communities of learners as well. But today we'll focus on the teaching membership, which some of you have already joined and belong. But basically we try to provide continuous professional development through the provision of webinars and 30-day challenges. We also encourage participation of members in both the newsletter, online classrooms, and other publishing opportunities, either by designing materials in our store and hopefully down the road actually presenting workshops that similar to the one that we're giving tonight. And of course we have our podcast, which many of you are aware of as well. And in general, the key value of the membership is again that it is providing a community of like-minded individuals and a support network to help you stay really centered on your own development goals, rather than just ad hoc one-off workshops. And the research into the value of this approach is quite extensive. So, and of course, actually, we do have an online course, and we offer our members discounts to those as well. And coming up, we will be offering some LYE Cubed courses, which are these 3-session courses where we really break down input, design, and evaluation of design in order to, again, facilitate ongoing development. So today, what's our focus? Well, today we're going to provide an understanding of discourse analysis, and basically we're going to break down what it is, and we're really going to focus on some short texts as models of language learning, and we'll focus on how what makes text cohesive and also what makes them coherent. Why is there value in discourse analysis or being able to analyze language? Well, first of all, it can really help our students deal with the language needs of their work, study, or exams. In particular, what I like to call, and what many call, their discourse communities. And also for you professionally, it's so that you can recognize the structures and purposes within text to, again, drive language learning. So,
Mike.
Well, yes.
So one thing I just wanted to add, and we didn't include this there, but I think something that we need to really make clear here is that every single language learner approaches a text from very different directions with many different expectations. So I think one question you should really reflect throughout the session is, what implications does this have for the way we deal with texts in the classroom? The fact of the matter is, a text on the page may generate very different texts in the minds of the learners. And I think that's something that we really need to bear in mind here.
Great point. So yeah, so let's get started with our first little warm-up activity. So I'll put us in breakout rooms. I'd just like you to just reflect a little bit about your own approach to texts, and think about the last reading, writing lesson you've taught, and just to Actually, I forgot to mention this earlier. We are going to focus on written texts today, so reading skills and processing skills. So think about the last reading and writing lesson you've taught. Describe what procedures you followed. So I'm going to put us in some breakout rooms here. And I'll give you each some time.
Aha. Can you unmute your mic there, Linda? Yeah, there we go.
Wow, I have two of you.
I don't count.
I don't know what's happened with the microphone, but we have just 1 minute. I was actually following New York Times website, and I found a lot of, like, even before, a long time ago, some good lessons, because those are authentic news reports. And so I was showing the students how maybe the difference is between a news report and an opinion-based article.
Nice.
So we were practicing ethos, pathos, and logos.
Yes.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Andrew's a fan. Yeah.
I am. Yeah.
So I must describe everything. I think I did follow like the very basic structure where I just show them kind of like a warm up, what they see the difference. And so they said one is more personal, one is like just straightforward. And so then we said, okay, so what has one and what the other doesn't is also some kind of hedging language, for example, or some kind of emotions in them. And so I said, okay, so exactly, this could be like an example of a paragraph that you can write like this or like that, and it's a strategy of persuasion. And so that's where you found a lot, and you have to be careful, because we were also talking like credibility of sources. And so then we went into, I just presented to them what exactly is the pathos, logos, and ethos, just like briefly, and then I gave them the model of the paragraph, and then I asked them, obviously I gave them a choice that I picked the articles for them, or they can pick their own articles. But for their homework, they obviously had to bring it up and then like write their own paragraph based on my model, how they would structure if they have some kind of issue and they want to present it to someone, whether it is a friend or whether it is maybe some kind of academic presentation about their own issue, what they are maybe facing personally, or they just want, they can imagine fictitious future that they are facing in their majors, and like what they would do, what they would write about, and something that they're knowledgeable about. So we were definitely talking about the language, but also sorry, I forgot. I was also linking it to the listening. So I show them like how, let's say, TED Talks, or how people also on YouTube speak when they are providing tutorial. That's what I wanted to say. It's different audience, right, that you cater to.
Yeah.
So it was like a lot of different things, and we practiced all throughout, like maybe.
It's like you did a lot of different things with one text, which is good, because that's kind of what we're going to talk about, is using one article for lots of different purposes.
Exactly. Yeah.
I like that activity too, because for slant or for bias, you know, even if it is a news, quote unquote, a news article, depending on the source, it can have a slant, right?
Exactly. Well, the one thing that I do want to improve is like looking at, they come from different countries. So how does that happen in their news reports and maybe other platforms that they can be using?
We're going to get cut off, sorry.
In their.
All right, everyone. Welcome back. I think everyone's back. So yeah. So definitely, I mean, I heard lots of really good information from Linda. Andrew, I didn't have a chance to listen to your process, but that's all right, because I'm not too concerned about you. Sorry, folks, inside joke there. Okay, so yeah, so I don't know, were your procedures the same? Were they similar?
Yep.
Pretty similar. Yeah, I think that, I would argue that this is probably not really a coincidence, that typically we are in many ways through our own training kind of conditioned to how we exploit texts, and in many cases we follow the same, or we're told to or recommended to follow the same kind of approach, where we might set up with some sort of pre-task, followed up by some sort of teaching of keywords, or something that's words that the students might need help with.
That's cheating.
I know, right? Well, and again, we've talked a little bit about this in some earlier workshops as well. And it followed up with some comprehension questions, maybe checking some gist based on some scanning they have done. Sorry, some skimming they have done, and then followed up with some more detailed questions about scanning type activities. And of course, we might follow up a little bit of discussion, and then some, and so on. So the point being, is there anything really wrong with that? Well, our training would tell us, and from personal practical experience, we would probably say no. But Leo, you wanted to jump in?
Yes. Let's move on to the next slide. I think, like as we said, there is no coincidence in that, but I think the fact of the matter is, and I was having a conversation with Leandro and Sandra, and they kind of had the same idea. And when we've done this session in different schools and different places, everyone kind of follows the same approach. And then once they finish, they move on to the next text. And that's where I think the problem lies. And I think we have, as a company, we've been advocating that much of the reading skills done in ESL classrooms or EFL classrooms tend to revolve around comprehension tasks. And our argument is that this practice is somehow detrimental to the development of reading and language proficiency, for that matter. It goes back to the same idea of listening, right? It does little more than just testing students' ability to find details in a text. And we've seen this a lot of the times. Our learners are able to find the details in the text, but when you ask them to give you a short summary of the text, they say, I don't really understand, right? So it basically means that they're not necessarily able to actually understand what's been read. So they're very rarely engaging in really, again, the key word for us here is processing language and improving their reading skills. So moving on to the next slide, Mike. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Celta here. A lot of teachers praise the Celta, and I have done the Celta back in God knows when, 2000, I guess. But I went through the Celta, and I wanted to understand why we follow this coincidental approach of this comprehension approach to reading. And what we found out, Mike, is that if we look there is absolutely no mention of giving out loads of comprehension questions or skimming and scanning. The focus there is on the last one there, actually the last two, decoding meaning and identifying problems or problem solving with reading. And I find that textbooks are not dealing with that, and a lot of the teaching is not really doing that, which brings us to the burning question. What is the burning question, Mike? Very simple. How does this current approach really empower learners to get a much deeper understanding of texts? And more importantly, how can texts improve their ability to not only use, but also understand the language? We're more interested in the processes. We're not interested in regurgitation of answers. So Mike, why texts?
Well, the rationale is that texts reveal how language is actually used, right? Mm-hmm. And that good language and that good language learners, I guess, are able to see patterns naturally emerge from these texts. What Schmidt calls the noticing hypothesis, which kind of takes, as you mentioned earlier in the class, earlier in the session, Leo, kind of takes us away from being the sage on the stage, and rather help guide students towards noticing the language. And the point is that noticing is actually quite difficult, and therefore it's teachers' role to guide this discovery along.
Can I add one thing there, Mike?
Yeah, go for it.
And I think one of the things that is often a very common assumption is that a lot of teachers, and I've seen this on Instagram, I've seen this on YouTube, a lot of people are under the impression, of course not you because you are very intelligent educators, but learning a language is much more than just learning its grammar, the vocab, and the pronunciation. And this is what's overly emphasized on these platforms. Even so, the ability to handle texts does not necessarily result from the ability simply to read and produce sentences. If a student is able to read and produce sentences, it doesn't really mean they're able to process texts. Mike.
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. And the fact is that text actually make up communication, right? And what's key is that we live in a world of text. We are surrounded by text. And in particular, the average North American is bombarded by 3,000 messages per day through either ads or radio or text message, phone calls, emails, meetings, and so on. Basically, communication comes across through these texts. So it is therefore crucial to analyze how language is actually used in these specific contexts. And this goes back to what Leo was saying earlier about relating that to also how our students are interpreting these texts as well. And also that these texts occur in both spoken and written discourses, and that in each given one, there are rules and patterns that we adhere to. And it's only through, again, analyzing these discourses that we can identify these textual patterns and word phrases and clauses, and even at the paragraph level.
Well, I kind of already talked about that.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this. But Leo, you wanted to talk about Henry Sweet.
Yeah, so I found this quote by Henry Sweet, who was an applied linguist, I think probably one of the first ones, who basically said that when the sounds of a language have once been mastered, the main foundation of its study will be connected texts. And I want to emphasize that he actually said connected texts, not words, not sentences, okay? And he actually went on and he said that it is only in connected texts that the language itself can be given with each word in a natural and adequate context. And I think this goes back to one of the things that we believe as a company is that we really need to expose learners to language in the wild. Textbook language is mostly at a sentence level. Sometimes we're teaching at a word level, but we're not really letting learners be exposed to language in the wild, which would be language in its natural and adequate context. And if we think about it, texts can deliver a great deal of information about the language, which brings us to the ESL classroom. So we're going to go through this very quickly.
Before we jump on, move on, Leo, I just wanted to jump in because when I read this morning, I kind of thought a little bit about the idea of text providing a kind of a landscape of the language, right? And that the students get a full picture, so to speak. So rather than this little highlighted section, you're actually getting the full landscape of the language. I really like this quote. Good job. But is that actually what we're encountering in our teaching context? And I think that most of us would say that maybe not, that actually this is typically what we find, some sort of decontextualized grammar exercises, either in the form of some sort of transfer drill or some other pattern which is not related to, again, the worlds of our students. And then not only that, we then kind of leave it up to our students to actually take all of these individual language points and then synthesize them together to create spontaneous speech and language performance and entities of production, so to speak. So we have our little, let me see if we have our little grammar McNuggets here, and that's decontextualized language practice, and then hopefully spontaneously they'll be able to again create these kind of.
And Mike, just to add something to what you just said,
Yeah.
Just to add to something like you said, this whole idea of landscape, I think that's one of the reasons why students, learners in general, often struggle with writing, is because all the language that they are often exposed to is always at either a word level or a sentence level. But whenever we get them to write an essay, we notice that it's just basically a forest with a bunch of wildlife in there, but nothing really connects. So the ecosystem of the language is really disorganized because we're only exposing them to what is Richard Caldwell's metaphor for the greenhouse?
The greenhouse.
The
Yeah.
greenhouse. We're keeping the language in the greenhouse, but not really exposing them to the language in the jungle, how it's actually is and is contextualized.
Yeah, and I think that's a nice lead-in to really, like, where does authentic language come from? Well, these texts often come from spoken text, written text, the receptive and productive, and of course the interactive. And I really like this kind of picture here. But I think, yeah, not only is it language in isolation, but it's language decontextualized, Leo. And I think that again, we're thinking about the worlds of our students and the worlds that they would like to enter, or their discourse community, and again, how can we help them along this process? And the key, I think, going back again, comes from Kreis, and that is that language always happens as a text and not just in isolation. And I would argue also happens within a specific context as well. However, I know that Linda's activity for her language awareness when in the first task was amazing, and I think that one disclaimer that we would add at this point is that we're not saying you shouldn't go and do the comprehension. We're actually saying that's the great place to start, but as Leo said earlier, that's usually where it's left, and students are not given the opportunity to engage further with text. So disclaimer is that we would actually, going forward in these slides that follow, it bears accentuating that we would, of course, not start with these types of activities. We would begin with some sort of comprehension and some sort of initial activity to familiarize the learners with the text, and then go back and return to those texts and analyze them further. And these ideas are purely not original. These are ideas from going left to right, from Sinclair, Michael Lewis, Scott Thornbury, and of course Dave Willis. And a lot of what we say tonight will sound familiar to you if you are familiar with these four people. Leo, sorry, it sounds like you want to.
No, I was just going to say we're going to, I think in June or July, we're going to start looking at the work of Dave Willis a little more in more depth. But yeah.
Yeah. And yeah. So again, so what are we recommending? Well, what we're suggesting here is that we move away from rules and work towards what we would call descriptive grammar. So rather than prescribing and saying how language is used, we're actually looking, like this young boy here, we're looking at how language is actually used in context, and then from that, describing the grammatical features that are happening as a result. And I mean, in terms of approach, this means kind of moving away from this kind of yes, no, right or wrong situation in which you are the sage on the stage and you are the transferring your knowledge down, rather and replacing that with a more of a guide on the side, where we look at not so much what to do in terms of a prescriptive approach, but rather reasons for language, as you can see here. So more of a descriptive approach to language. And again, going back to what Leo said earlier about our students, this is where I think the Tarzan analogy that Dave Willis talks about in Rules, Patterns, and Words comes into play. And I think that, again, we need to think a little bit about the types of language or the types of communities our students want to enter and perform in and perform and use English to join, and then help them guide them towards discovering, if they want to join those communities, what are some of the features of language they should adhere to, both on a grammatical and a socio-cultural level as well. And really, and Dave Willis breaks down, really this involves kind of three learning processes. And the first one being, again, recognition. So encouraging our learners to notice the features of language and its use by drawing attention to it. Also by focusing on systems and hypothesizing about how these grammatical systems work. And it's only through kind of hypothesizing how they work and through this recognition that they can then start to experiment with the language. And that really is our job, is to give them opportunities to experiment with the language. And again, we see task-based language teaching as a great way of doing this. But again, we're talking about text-based language teaching.
And Mike,
I don't know if you wanted to jump in there.
No, I was just going to say, and if you look at these three learning processes, again, can you go back to the first one? The first one is noticing, right? Going back to Schmidt's hypothesis, getting students to notice specific features of the language, drawing their attention to it. The second one is what we call the Lego, right? They have to build these systems. They have to hypothesize, right? And in the third one, we give them the freedom to explore, right? Here, you're in the jungle. Now go ahead. Find more examples of this, or make your own choices, as opposed to me telling you. And in none of these processes, we have teaching grammar rules. In none of this, there is no explicit teaching of grammar here. So we're moving away from this idea of, here are the grammar rules, as opposed to, why don't you tell me the reasons why you've made the choices that you've made. So we're moving away from grammar rules to reasons. So from rules to reasons is a good way of thinking about how we should be approaching language education.
And I would just add that in terms of our approach with our student membership, we really kind of changed the way that we view the classroom in lieu of this, right, Leo?
Mm-hmm.
So basically, we see the classroom more as a place for prospective reflection. So encouraging our students to think a little bit about what to anticipate and to kind of forecast how they think language might be used, and all the other kind of socio-cultural dimensions that go along with it. Let them and play with stage 3 here and explore and use the language and operate in the community, and then again come back to the classroom, and then we encourage this kind of retrospective reflection in which we're asking them to evaluate, did it work? Is it the same? What choices did I make? Why did someone make a different, as Leo said earlier, why did someone make a different choice from me? How does that change the message? And then repeat. And we really feel that this is the role of the classroom, and it's and we see this as the future, especially with online education.
Yeah. Well, having said that, with online education, one of the important things is to do a check-in. So let's pause for a moment, and maybe everyone can think about a question that you have so far, or anything that you want to ask, or any observation or anything that you've noticed before we move on to the second part of the session. You can type if you don't feel comfortable unmuting your microphone, but we want to give you 30 seconds to process all of this.
Which is good.
We're going down the roller coaster now. But these three processes, we will explore them in a little bit more, in more depth when we start talking a little bit about the works of Dave Willis. And I think it's something that we're going to be doing in July, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah. So any questions? No? Everyone good? Let's move on, Mike.
Sure.
All right. Well, so, let's go to the first activity. So the first activity is actually, that's the one. It's a haiku. It's a Japanese haiku-like. It's not really a haiku, but it's a very short text. And I think what I wanted to emphasize here is how very short texts can deliver a great deal of information about the language. So Mike is gonna show you the haiku, and as you read, I want you to consider the features of the language that this short text embodies. And again, going back to the learner, okay? How do you think your learners will approach this text? Different directions, different expectations. And you as a teacher, when you look at a text like this, how much language do you see here? So I'll give everyone 30 seconds to analyze. Would you say this is a complete text? Yeah. So I spent a little bit of time, and this is a complete text. If we look at it, there are about 21 words, and 2 words are repeated twice. There are 2 sentences, the second of which basically consists of 2 clauses, making it a compound sentence. Out of the 26 letters of the alphabet, 7 are missing there. There are 16 consonant sounds, which are represented here out of 24. 15 of the 20 vowel sounds, if we're considering the IPA here. There's a very typical distribution of both content and grammar words. Again, content words being words that have meaning, nouns, adjectives, verbs, and adverbs, and grammar words being words that have no meaning, but have grammatical functions, such as prepositions, conjunctions, pronouns, and so forth. There are a total of 21 words in the text. 15 of these are in the top 200 words in English, according to frequency counts. 7 of these words are in the top 20 most frequent words in English. When we look at English sentence organization, we have all 8 parts of speech represented here. Of course, there are no adjectives unless you count, what is the word, my as an adjective here. We have a verb. We have verbs in the past participle. We have a lot of auxiliary verbs. We have, we have do. We have 2 finite verbs, wait and appear. We have examples of noun phrases with my hut, every evening. We have verb phrases. We have prepositional phrases. And if we look at this, the sentences realizes the main functions in every sentence in English. And Mike can actually type this up, but a lot of us are taught that the structure of a grammatical sentence in English is subject, verb, object. And we like to say that this is incorrect. This, it's basically noun phrase plus verb. And you will say, but Leo, why just noun phrase plus verb? Because if you look at the structure of English, every subject is a noun phrase. But students often think that a subject is one word, as opposed to looking at the subject as a noun phrase. So for us, we find that teaching a student that a noun phrase plus verb is the common structure of sentences in English is actually helping them process, again, because the point here is to help them process texts. Anyway, we don't have to get into the detailed analysis because we're going to look at the activities in a second, but this detailed analysis is simply to show how one very short text can have so much language in it. And it also illustrates how much potential texts have for the purposes of exemplifying features of the language. And as Mike said, all texts, not sentences, not words, have grammar, especially if they are authentic texts. And language as a whole is an ecosystem that shares a feature of many other complex systems. From its smallest self-standing components, which are texts, are basically, I would argue, miniature representations of the system as a whole. And when we talk about the system, we're talking about this lexico-grammatical system. There's no division between vocabulary and grammar. They kind of work together. So if we look at this text, there's a lot of grammar locked up. So the question for all of you then is, what potential does working with text have as opposed to working from a word or a sentence level? That's for everyone to think about. Yeah.
can I ask, just to clarify, what is exactly working from a word sentence level?
When Mike talked a little bit about the ESL classroom, and he showed an example of Tom is a student. He studies every day. That's an example of working at a sentence level. A lot of the times we work at a word level. We show students just a word. We say, Michael is very stubborn. So when we give students examples like that, we're working at a word level. It doesn't really give us the entire context in which the word stubborn exists. So we're looking more at the environment of the word, Linda, and we find that working with words or working with sentences, it doesn't really provide learners with the entire ecosystem. That's what we're trying to say.
I was just wondering because it sounds so weird to be doing the word sentence level.
Well, if you look at all published materials, that's all they have.
Right. Yeah.
I don't.
And that's why we don't like textbooks.
That's right. That's fantastic. Yeah. That's a great.
Leandro, you wanted to say something. I feel like you were.
No. I just I was just going to jump in about the published materials.
I thought Leandro was going to say something.
Oh, Leandro. Sorry, I can't.
Yeah, he's.
I thought you said Landry.
I was just processing, really. A lot of food for thought, indeed, and yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, my mind is spinning at the moment, but I'll catch up.
All right, let's. One of the things I wanted to say, Mike, before we jump into language awareness, is that grammar, most of the time, and when I say grammar, I'm talking about lexical grammar. There's no dichotomy between grammar and vocab. Grammar is most often locked up. A lot of these features, they are not of much use to learners if A, they don't notice these features, going back to the learning processes, right? If they don't recognize these things, they're not going to be able to learn them. If they don't know how representative, how typical, how frequent, and how generative these features are. And that is where the teacher comes in. Okay? Mike, we can skip through the language awareness so we can actually jump into the activity.
Yeah.
Let's jump into, because we kind of already talked about that. So working with texts, yeah. So does anybody know what a mini saga is? All right, well, a mini saga is basically a story of exactly 50 words, no more, no less. It's challenging. And it tells a complete story. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And it makes a point. It's either a dramatical point or there is some sort of political truth in it. And it must be a saga, right? It has to, like, for example, right now I'm reading the Odyssey, and it's on a mini saga. That's a long saga. It's about 800 pages. We don't want to use texts like that. But mini sagas are very good for this reason. So we're going to look at one right now. So I'll give everyone 30 seconds to read this mini saga. It won the best mini saga in 2001. The interesting thing is a lot of the times students often ask me, you can ask your students, right? Like, as what Leandro said, like, where would you find such text? What's the purpose of writing this text, right? Mm-hmm. So we always have to think about these, what do we call them? This discourse, this genre-based teaching. I think there's a little bit of that at the beginning. We never really do that with our learners, but Leandro and Sandra mentioned that in our conversation. They ask, like, who's the audience? Why did this writer write this text, right? What's the intended message here? And students often will feel like, oh, but, you know, is he a real person? Is he a replica? I don't know. I don't really know the answer. I think that's how the writer decided to deliver this mini saga. But let's go back to what we said earlier, right? We want to unpack, we want to unlock all these language features that we find in a text, because grammar is locked up. So here are a couple of very simple examples of tasks that you can use with your learners. And again, depending on the level. If you're working with low-level students, you can adapt this. But if you're working with high-level learners, you can use basically all of these. So the first one is find an example of each part of speech. Mike and Andrew and I, we say this all the time. Parts of speech are the foundation of the language. If students don't know parts of speech, they will never be able to produce language accurately and fluently. Identify the grammar words and the content words, right? How many of each are there? Are any words repeated? Why? And you will often find that words that are often repeated usually mean one thing. Can anybody guess why words are repeated in a text? Sorry, Sandra?
Emphasis?
Yes, that's one reason. What else?
It's usually on purpose, but
Probably because of the topic of the text. They're probably keywords, right? Yeah, in this text, we'll look at which keywords are repeated. What else do we have? Noun phrases. Identify noun phrases. And then ask them to categorize them, right? Is this determiner plus noun? Is this adjective plus noun, right? There's many different noun phrases are by far the most difficult thing for learners to process. Identify all the pronouns. If you're teaching a lesson on pronouns, have your students find all the pronouns, all the possessive adjectives, and then ask them, what do they refer to? Are there any reference? Do we have any isophoric, anaphoric, cataphoric, right? Translating. Let me translate here if none of you have understood what I just said. But I think most of you already know. Anaphoric referring backwards, cataphoric referring forwards, and esophoric referring to someone outside the text, right? That's something that our learners never really do, right? Texts don't do that. What else, Mike? What else do we have there? Oh, here's one that I love doing with my students. Underline all the articles, especially my Asian students. And then, again, going back to the idea of system building and exploration. Explain the use of all these articles in the text, including the article that is not there, the zero article. So, again, you're moving away from rules to reasons. Let your learners give you the reasons. Your job is not to say this is right or this is wrong. Your job is to say, okay, but why? What difference would it make if he added the article there? See, we're moving away from this is right, this is wrong to like, let's encourage exploration. And one more, Mike, would be, identify the prepositional phrases. I have a huge pet peeve with people who post activities where they have to gap the preposition. You know why? Because prepositions are not learned alone. Prepositions are often connected to noun phrases. So teaching a sentence, going back to what Linda said, and underline or gapping the preposition, you're only reinforcing this nature that prepositions are individual words that are not connected to anything. After a preposition, there's only one rule in English that never changes, and it's universal. After a preposition, you always have a noun phrase. And you can quote me on that.
All right.
All right, let's move on. What else do we have? So here are examples for each part of speech. As you can see, we have nouns, verbs, adjectives. We have an example of each part of speech in this text. And the interesting thing is, if you look at it, the second question was content and grammar words. And interestingly, Mike, if we go to the next one, you will see that we have an interesting ratio of 1-to-1. So we have 25 content words to 25 grammar words, which just goes to show, guys, everyone, that grammar words, they challenge learners to tell you what, like grammar words, for some reason, are often neglected in our teaching at the expense of content words. But you cannot write without grammar words. And the point here is to highlight that, again, content words are great. We pay more attention to them, but I think we should really pay more attention to these small words. And words repeated, Sandra said, of course, functional words will always be repeated because the top 50 words in English, the top most frequent words in English are all functional words. Does anybody know what the first word is? The first most frequent word in English is?
No.
I think, Leandro, I could read his lips. I think he said the.
Yes.
The is number one. And I is number two because we love talking about ourselves. Aren't we selfish people? And here's another example of noun phrases they can not only identify but also categorize. So we have determiner plus noun, determiner plus adjective plus noun. So that way they're not processing subject as one word. I had a vivid dream last night. What's the subject? I. Object. The verb had. Okay, what's the noun phrase? A vivid dream. And then, of course, last night is an adverbial. But these are just 4 examples. So this is a good activity for recognizing and for building the system. And of course, you can always offer some sort of exploitative task. You can use this with any text at any level. Of course, as Roberta teaches a different level, she's not going to ask her students, hey, find the noun phrase. They don't even know what a phrase is. So you might want to, if you're teaching low-level students, I would say start with articles or start with determiners. Determiners are so important in English, but we don't talk about them. Why? Because textbooks overemphasize grammar. Discuss the differences that the choices make. So for example, if as I said earlier, if you have a 0 article, what difference would it make if a student rewrites the text using a definite article? How would that change the meaning of that sentence? Again, guys, moving away from right and wrong into hypothesis building.
Yeah, and just to add there, Leo, because I know that what a question that often comes up when we talk about text-based language teaching, and actually in particular task-based language teaching, is it actually level specific? And I think that this kind of short example that you've provided actually shows that we could probably even do this with young learners, right? Even with just looking at colors. Okay, what comes after colors or adjectives? What are some opposites of adjectives that appear here? What are the patterns that come after them, and so on? And I think that, just to reinforce what Leo has said, is that not only is this not level specific, but I would argue that it's also possible to do this with young learners as well.
Because that is often a question, Mike, that we get in sessions.
Yes.
But this only works for, I find that a lot of teachers always say, but this only works with high-level students. No, it works with any level, as I said, but you choose the focus.
That's right.
I think that's actually the opposite. It should come from the lower levels up, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. If you start this with a low-level student, then I think by the time they get to a higher level, they have been able to process text at a much faster speed, I would say. So now it's your turn. We're going to give you, there's a handout. Andrew's going to share the link to the handout. And we're going to give you 3 minutes to think about what kinds of activities would you use to unlock the grammar. You don't have to design 10. We're asking you to think about 1. Okay, so it's a very short text. It's called Intelligence, Nature, or Nurture. This is at an intermediate level, maybe B1, B1 plus. You as a teacher, what would you choose to focus on here? If you want to look at the handout, the link is in the chat, but otherwise you can just read it as well. Task 3 on the handout. Thank you. We're going to ask you to unmute yourself if you have any ideas, and you can share them with us. Remember, there's no right or wrong answer here.
Well, I could use it to teach passive voice.
So you would design a task for that, right, Sandra? Just like
Yeah.
find an example of the passive voice. Okay.
Yeah, or present perfect.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe countable and uncountable nouns.
Okay. What else? Anybody has different ideas?
I was thinking of working with cohesive devices.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, some information about this, and then asking learners perhaps to identify the references there.
Yeah.
Although they grew up in different environments, their schools, so who are they? And this kind of thing. And also a little bit perhaps of functional language. Like some studies suggest, so this is typical of more academic writing, isn't it?
Yeah. A lot of noun clauses with that, right? Scientific studies suggest that. Scientific studies report that. A lot of academic language, a lot of research language is noun clauses with that. Yeah. Yeah. Those are all good words. I like the idea of focusing on words like this. Some information about this, and then have the learners rewrite that. Some information about how intelligent parents are more likely to have intelligent children has been gathered from recent studies. Now change the order of this sentence. Would it still make sense? Recent studies of identical twins were brought up separately, have provided information about blah, 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 things like that. Relative clauses, right? Helping us to identify the antecedent. As you said, Leandro, although, change that sentence, write it with but. Change that sentence, use a different conjunction here. Again, it's not really so much gap filling it, but really asking students to do other things with this text. And as you can see, guys, there's, in other words, as Leandro said, how would you rewrite that sentence without using in other words? What is the function of in other words there, right? I think the point we're trying to make is that not working with one sentence, but working with a text is more likely to unlock a lot more language than if you were to work with words or sentences, or at a sentence level. The only reason why I numbered the sentence was just for clarity. Anybody has anything else to add to this?
I just wanted to add here.
Go ahead, Roberta.
No, I was just wondering if it was possible to come up with like some speaking activities, comparing like people that were born in a kind of environment, a certain environment, with the other ones that were born like in different kinds of families. So we would like maybe bring more language, comparatives, and how like nature and nurture could actually develop a person's personality, or maybe like some speaking activity could be added as well with comparatives.
Good point, Roberta. We talked about this in the beginning. This is what we would do after you've done all of that. You've done some reading, you've done some speaking, you've done what we call the comprehension approach, right? You deal with the text, and then after you do some speaking, it's what Mike said at the beginning. Normally what we would do is we would move on to the next text. I find that you can spend so much time with one text and teach so much more language than just going through the comprehension tasks that you said, the speaking and all that, but then come back to the text. There are many more things that you can explore here. And I think but that's a good point.
But what I'd like to just say here is that like working with like teenagers, sometimes they don't like reading. And I think that we should bring small texts like these ones and show how important like it is. Because if you bring, for example, a text that is 1 or 2 page ones, they just feel like kind of no, I will not read that much. And
it's a good point.
That's what I feel here.
Oh, it's 100%. I think I think in the classroom, even if you're working with a longer text, Roberta, I would say work with the first paragraph for like a week. Spend a week. It's what Mike and Andrew and I like to call milking the material for what it's worth. Often see teachers, I'm looking for materials, I'm looking for text. I see teachers in our colleges and universities photocopying all these materials, and I'm like, you don't need to photocopy all of that. You have like what we looked at that first haiku, you can spend days, weeks exploring the same text. The problem is, and Andrew can talk about this, one of the problems that we often see in language teaching is that, learners process the text. They understand the meaning of the text. And then we move on to the next one. And then they have to go through the process of, hey, Andrew, do you remember that? You can talk a little bit about that.
That's a pet peeve of mine. I mean, this is not dependent on the level, because every level we have readings that are too challenging for some students, maybe too easy for other ones. It's just, but we spend a lot of time priming and aligning and getting them ready and then working through the text maybe properly. And I could take one class, maybe two classes, just to get them to understand and do a summary or the main ideas or whatever. And then we move on. All that effort is wasted, in my mind, wasted when we move on the next day to another text or a video or whatever it is. And we just do the same process again. And that process is important. But when we go through it, why not, as Leo said, why not milk it for something else and for all the other things? Because now they understand the meaning. They can go into the micro elements or super micro elements or whatever and really get stuff out of it. I was going to say something else, Leo. I don't know if you said this before because I had to stop this for a second. But also with working with text as opposed to word or sentence level is even in something short like this with only 4 sentences, you can even get into then seeing different types of sentences, complex, compound, and simple, and how does the writer build from usually a first sentence being a simple sentence and then using more complex structures as the discourse develops.
There's even
you're noticing and making them make those choices. When do I use simple sentences? When do I use compound and complex sentences, conditionals, etc.? And then comparing that to the model, that even a short model like this, they can do that.
Here's a question I would ask students, and I'm going to ask you guys, is if you look at sentence number 4, we all know that it's a complex sentence and we can always change the order. But my question to you would be, could we change the order of that sentence without changing the cohesiveness and the coherence of the text? Can we say their school results were often remarkably similar, although they grew up in different environments? Would that make sense? And I'm going to let Mike take over that one because this is something that he likes. Sentence number 4, because this is already priming you for the CUBE course, because we're going to be talking about end-weight principle eventually. But I think I commented on someone's Instagram this week. The question is not starting with although or having although in the middle. It's what comes before and what comes next.
Just going to say you'd have to look at sentence 3 and then decide if sentence 4 could be reversed. And for the cohesion of the text, we would probably not want to actually do that in this case, because
and also think about sentence 5, which we don't have. Yeah,
that's right, and then sentence 5, which we don't know as well.
And that's another activity, right? What would be an ideal next sentence for this text? We're not really often doing that with our students, and I think Roberta's point is essential. I think we need to be working with shorter texts and spend more time exploiting texts. I think our training is not designed to help teachers exploit text. What the Celta does, and more often the Delta does too, is really just offer another text to the students' repertoire, but doesn't really teach or help learners or teachers to actually really explore all the grammar that is locked up in a text. Does anybody have the answer to my question?
I don't, but can I comment on that and
of course.
Ask a question?
Yeah.
Well, I have to work with a text comprehension with students with low level or no level of English.
Oh, great.
Because I don't know if you know this, but the entrance system to university here in Brazil is based on text comprehension, and I have to teach. Basically, I have to teach students who have no knowledge of English to be able to read and interpret a text or texts in English. And what I usually do is I work a lot with comic strips. Because my students don't like reading. So this is a way of having them engage with the text because they are short and interesting and funny. And I also use song lyrics a lot. Because I do some research about the kind of music they like, and I try to explore grammar, rules, and meaning, and whatever through songs. And it works. And Linda has helped me a lot, but I would like to know if there's like a text corpus where I can find texts about different subjects or with different grammar content, because it's really difficult and it takes a lot of time for me to find nice text to take to my students. So this is a problem, a big problem I have.
According to their actually necessity or their needs and their interest, because that's it. If they're not interested, sorry, they are not going to feel like in the mood for reading that.
Guys, I would say even text messages between you and someone in English could be something that you could use in the classroom. I think this generation, especially younger students now, I find that they don't want to work with longer texts. Even myself, when I'm teaching, I find that I start with one paragraph and I spend about 2 weeks on the same paragraph. And then we move on and the student's like, Leo, are we still reading the same text? I'm like, yeah, we're still reading it. But she's like, oh, wow, but we're still doing like different things. I said, yeah, because all the grammar, all the lexes of a language can be found in one text. If you know how to, again, the point is you have to be able to unlock the language.
What
BPS,
about unlocking parents' minds?
That's a different story.
If you don't go on like with the material, say, but you have been the unit 1 for 2 months.
But Roberta, so like, that's a good point. I was going to say,
it's a reality. Yeah.
That's a reality. But I think it is our duty as educators to actually disrupt the way the educational system is. And I'm very unhappy with the way things are. I don't think we are actually really educating anyone. I'll give you one very good example. My son is, doing work from school here. And of course, his teacher sent him an activity about COVID-19, right? And I was like, oh, wow, this is his, it was a reading. He had to read the text and answer the questions. Of course, he wasn't really reading an answer. He was just copying the answers from the text. And I could see that even a very young, proficient kid in the language, he doesn't understand any of these things that we're talking about because his teachers don't know how to do this. His teachers don't know how to look at language like this. It is not the student's job to memorize rules. It is the teacher's job to know the rules so you can encourage students to come up with reasons. And I think that's the essential thing. And to answer your question, Roberta, I think you have to ask yourself this: do I want to be better than other people, or do I want to be different than other people? And I think for us as a company, we don't want to be better than anyone else, because being better is a finite game. But being different, that's the long-term goal for us. We don't like the way people teach languages. It's what Andrew said. It's a lot of content. Oh, my students know a lot about this. Okay, great. But can they use the language? No. Why? Because you're always adding more. I'm going to quote Dave Willis, who said, a perfect textbook would be a collection of very short texts with 1,000 different ways of exploring those texts. That's what Dave Willis said the perfect textbook would be. And I agree with him. I think if we are able to find these very short texts, as you said, Sandra, like where do we find them? I go to these 2 websites, BPS, which is the British Psychological Society, and I use the Conversation, because authentic, short, and there's a lot of languages that we can use to unlock things there. Mike, do you want to answer the question quickly before we finish? Why?
Yeah, well, I wasn't reading the chat, so I don't know if anyone said this. So I'm very sorry if someone has said this, and I'm just repeating the obvious. But yeah, if we look at sentence 3, how does it end? Well, it ends with us talking about how it was even where this information came from, and it came from identical twins who were brought up separately. So because it ends with that, the next sentence must begin with a reference back to that. So it says, although they grew up in different environments, their school results are their school results were often remarkably similar. And again, we're beginning with the known information, the theme, and we're finishing with the comment or the ream. So, and then as what Andrew said, what would come next would maybe be a statistic showing that one student or instances in which the students had the same answer. So maybe 9 out of the 10 sets of twins produce the same answer. So it's because of what comes before and what comes after. And I think this goes back to Linda's earlier point about the difference between sentence level grammar and this kind of landscape approach to learning, language acquisition and language learning and teaching. And that is that even sentences do not exist in isolation, right? And I think this goes back to what Leandro said about pronouns. I mean, when I look at this, and Leo, your example of sentence 3, some information about this, textbooks don't teach pronouns referring back to noun phrases. They teach pronouns referring back to the man or the boy or the class. So again, complex subjects and objects, they're enormously difficult for students, and therefore they can't process what they're reading. So this would be a great example, sentence 3, I mean, would be a great example of how this, by simply just focusing on this, you're actually looking at a much larger framework of language, in this case, noun phrases, and how they link across sentences. I just think it's great. All of your ideas are amazing. Yeah.
And this adds to what Sandra was saying. Like, I think if you start looking at short texts like this, Sandra, and ask your students to actually do this kind of work, what is the word this referring backwards to? I think when students read a text, they will be able to process this a lot faster. But again, published materials are not going to do that, unfortunately. Okay, let's move.
One thing there?
No.
I was just going to say, for me, like, to answer Sandra's question with like really low levels, I mean, it's hard to find authentic stuff. If it's only 4 sentences, I mean, I'll write something and I can talk about topics that I know that they like, and we can use the language that way. But also, again, talking about being different, a reading exercise doesn't necessarily have to be reading right away. So I know, Leo, you've done this, and Mike, you've done this. If that's the goal, that's my aim, I might start with dictating this sentence by sentence and having the students go through, okay, well, sentence 1 is about this. What do you think? What's a possibility? What would come next? Mm-hmm. And there's a whole bunch of different possibilities, obviously. And then go to sentence 2. Okay, now what do you think sentence 3 is going to talk about? And then going through and then give them this text afterwards to see if they're those kind of prediction tasks, which we usually do just actually by reading, were true or not true. And true only means, is it logical in that sense? It's the same as what.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, even stopping it, like, in other words, what do you think the next sentence is going to do? Right? Like, these are all very good ideas. Yeah. I mean, you can always go back to the text.
That at word level can be effective, but not.
Yes. Word level. Yeah. A word level within a textual level. Yes.
Parsing type of.
Parsing. Activity. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Let's move on, Mike. Let's go to the follow-up now. So a good example of a follow-up would be to remove, going back to the same text. Again, we're not moving on to a new text. Going back to the same text, I removed all the function words, and I asked my students to put the function words back in there. So let's see if any of you guys remember. Staying overnight. What are the next 2 words?
Sleeping with friends.
Sleeping with friends. No. But why did you say sleeping with friends? The next sentence says sleep.
Oh, yeah.
So staying overnight And you said his friends. Why not my friends, Sandra? Why did you choose his friends?
I don't know.
It's a good question. But you see the point I'm trying to make, right? I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, but I'm asking you, like, why did you choose his? Why not the friends, right? Staying overnight with, because you stay with somebody, right? So stay with, so staying overnight with his friends, staying overnight with
some friends.
With some friends. What difference does it make if you say his friends to some friends, right? His sleep, disturbed. Passive voice, yeah. Yeah, so that's just one example of that. I have one more, Mike, before we move on. Yeah, so go back to the dog. Yeah.
Yeah, because we have another example to play with, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is another example of a very short text. I like using jokes. So Sandra, you asked me like what kinds of texts. Roberta, this also addresses your question. Using jokes with your students. Just type, jokes in English. I think there's a website. I can't remember the name now, but I'll look it up and I'll send it to everyone. But working with very short jokes like this one, which is a terrible joke if you ask me. But an example of this is...
No such thing as a terrible joke.
Yeah.
With my high school students, I have no problem because the material is full of texts. I don't know if you can see it, but it brings like very short text, so I can explore a lot. I have time to explore. The problem is that these students have low level or no level of English.
So grade the task a little more. Make it a much easier. For example, find all the words that start with the letter M. I don't know. You know your students better, right? So you know what they're capable of.
I work a lot with cognate words because this is a way for them to understand the main idea of the text if they just compare it to our native language.
Right. So this is a very good example of that. And then, of course, another task I've done with my students would be, can you tell me what the text is about by just looking at the function words? Right? So you give them the grammar words and you challenge them to tell you what the text is about. And then you can do the opposite. You can give them the content words and get them to guess what kind of text it is. As Leandro said, what is it about and what the missing words are. And then you can ask them to tell you what words comprise each version. So, this one, Leo, has only content words. This one has only grammar words. And then you can ask them what kind of words are grammar words and what kind of words are content words. What kind of words would go before man? You can say a man or the man. So there's only two options. How does that change the meaning of that sentence? Ask them to estimate the proportion of grammar to content words. In this joke, I did the math. It's 26 to 26. So you have 26 grammar words, 26 content words. Give them a new text. Repeat this. The point is very simple, is to highlight that we as teachers in published materials pay more attention to the larger content words, but to produce and to process, we also have to pay attention to the small words, the grammar words. Another variation I just thought of, student A has the content version, student B has the grammar version. They take turns trying to guess what the word is for each blank space. Right? Strategies. What strategies can they use to guess the word? Or before a noun, we always have a determiner or an adjective, right? Went to, pub, right? Because you go to a place. The point is this, grammar words are short, but they are very high frequency words. They have no translation in any language. And labeling them, this is a preposition, this is a conjunction. Labeling is not important. That's your job as a teacher. But they need to appreciate the role these little words play in making English grammatical, because English is only grammatical because of these. And the last example I have there is you can give them all the function words, but give them not in order and see if they are able to put them back in the text. Which brings us to our conclusion. Final thoughts. Again, very simple. Expose your students to text rather than isolated sentences. Again, as Mike said in the beginning, drawing attention categorizing, all these features that binds texts together. What else? Move away from this the way published materials are. It's memorizing right, wrong answers, and move into something more like a hypothesis building or collaborative exploration. How many different ways can you rewrite the same text, right? Try to use a variety of texts, as we said, recognition, system building, and exploratory. We're definitely going to be talking more about these three learning processes in future sessions. Also, try to be, as Mike said, try to be less prescriptive. Don't tell them the rules. Let them explore. Give them the tools to just use language. To take. I honestly think that students lack confidence because they don't memorize the rules, because they don't feel comfortable reciting the rules, and therefore they feel less confident. But if we just encourage students to take more risks, then I think their confidence will increase, which brings me to a couple of things that I've added there. Create a classroom corpus for each level that you have. I would say maybe 4 to 5 texts per level, and then explore these texts, milk them for what they're worth. Also grade them. Grade the tasks, not the text. Oh, Leo, this is too difficult for my students. It's not. It might be, but you can ask them to do very simple things. Underline all the articles in this text. If you're teaching articles, if you're teaching colors, as Mike said, underline all the colors. One thing I've noticed in the nurture and intelligent, nurture or nature, is there was a lexical chain with the word intelligence. So there was intelligent, intelligence, right? So there were repetition of words there. Give your students feedback, not only on sentence level, but also on overall cohesiveness. So basically asking your students, okay, not just correcting their grammar, but saying this sentence doesn't connect to the previous sentence because of what Mike said with this idea of topic and comment. Stop breaking the language down. Stop saying this is that, this is this, this is the present continuous, this is the present perfect, this is grammar, this is vocabulary. They're all part of one system. And of course, students should stop practicing grammar in a PPP fashion to get it right. Instead, I tell my students, get it wrong. It is only by getting it wrong that you learn. But when you teach from a PPP paradigm, you're only encouraging students to get it right. No, you didn't use the present perfect right. Try again. I don't like that. And finally, and this is my most important point, teach less, but more thoroughly, in more depth, in more detail. And that's it. Thank you.
I'm going to show those for the recording. And of course, make sure that you do get in touch with us by info@learnyoungenglish.com. And if you're not already a member, then please look into the membership. As you can tell, we have, I think all of our members are present, and it's clear that we're learning a lot because we're in a community. And not in isolation. And I say that a little tongue in cheek. But yeah, are there any questions that you'd like us to cover?
Yeah, we have a few minutes of Q&A.
Yeah, you said you get jokes from somewhere. Can you share?
Oh yes, the website. In the meantime, another question. Jokes in I think the website.
Well, it just was thinking that I want the students to kind of because it's more going back to what we had when you guys visited our school, and so I was thinking how much of preparation I do, and it's very true that they should do the preparation because they should come up with the material that they want to based on what they want to learn. So yeah, I started that from this week. Every day somebody's going to present a joke, and maybe instead of news report or something, and then also that they would have a word of the day, and we would have to use it throughout the whole day and use it, and whoever uses it in a context, they will get a point. Just like a reaction. But yeah, so maybe we can start analyzing the jokes, right? Just like you had this maybe today it's going to be articles, right? Or this week it's going to be articles. So every single joke that you prepare is going to be, okay, prepare the activity, and then at the end it will be the whole joke, just like what you were showing in your slides, right?
But even if you go to the website that I shared with you guys, it's called esljokes.net. What I don't like about the website is that it only focuses on one point. And again, it reinforces this idea that every joke, you're only teaching one thing. I don't think we should be giving students a newer text until we've explored everything that we can possibly explore from that specific text. I don't like this idea of, okay, for example, if you look at the contents of that website, the first joke is called the polar bear, and the focus is the present simple. But I was looking at the text, there's so much more you can explore there. There's ellipses, there's imperatives, there's so much more. But again, I think the person who designed the website was also thinking like a textbook writer normally thinks, which is one word, one specific language point at a time. It goes back to what Andrew said. I think we need to spend more time, teach less, but more thoroughly. Spend more time with one joke, Linda, as opposed to, okay, this joke, we looked at the present perfect. Let's move on to the next joke. No. What else can we explore in this joke? There's so much more. There's so much more language we can unlock from that, as opposed to just moving on to the next one, to the next one. Because every time you move on to the next text, you have to go through all that comprehension.
True. Thanks
right?
for that.
Yeah. Any more questions? I hope it wasn't too much.
I do. Sorry, maybe somebody just wanting to ask you something, because it is okay to work with very short text when you have lower levels. And I do believe in higher levels as well, even with me.
Mm-hmm.
However, when I have a high level and they're kind of a, how do I call them, transition level to the university or college, they do have to work with, let's say, different skills, such as like analyzing the credibility of sources. So yes, I can still do that, but they have to also be able to read long texts, right? So I understand that I can show them in the class and during our session all of that we went through with you here. Just they would know how to apply it on longer text. That's the idea, sure. But let's say if they have to deal with the complex text.
I'll see if Michael Andrew wants to take that one.
Yeah, what do you mean by a complex text?
Well, let's say like journal article.
Okay. Then I would argue that nothing changes. Then we look at the genre analysis of what does a journal article look like, how is it created, what does it contain, and I think you're aware of that. The challenge might be like with certain subjects such as creative writing, and I know Andrew might want to comment on this because this is his background, like literature in particular, where they are processing two things. They're processing the actual structure. So this is where the skills in terms of how to process information become very important. Where does a sentence begin and end? What is the subject of that sentence? If it's a very long and poetic, complex subject, and where is the verb? And then what comes after the verb, like just breaking down how to read something like that on a surface level, but then also interpreting it in terms of its cultural reference, because again, they might not, even if they have a very high linguistic ability, they might not have or they might need help with the building their cultural capital to handle such a text. And as Leo said, they might know the anaphoric and cataphoric reference, but they might not have that exophoric or external reference, right? So that I think is a bigger challenge. I think essays, journal articles, lab reports, case studies, business emails, business letters, and cover letters and resumes all share very kind of systematic features, but I think the creative writing elements are the hardest. But luckily for us in Canada, a lot of the students we get internationally aren't interested in studying those subjects, but that's actually a real gap, because if we ever were to get a lot of students studying those subjects, I don't think we'd be actually able to help them based on how EAP programs, English for Academic Purposes programs, are set up, because they're very much set up for the STEMs, the engineering, physics, math, economics, and so on. Andrew, did you want to comment on creative writing? Because I think that's a bigger challenge, not so much.
I mean, that's what you just add on to what you said. I mean, genre analysis is the key to all of those way more complex texts that students may or may not have to read. And if we're talking about journal articles, then I mean, in that case, the students are just joining all of us in being challenged with reading journal articles, because they're hard to read regardless, right?
Sure.
And I think I challenge a lot of the ideas that our students in undergraduate programs really actually have to read a lot of journal articles. I'm not sure prepping them to do that is a good use of time, but that's specific to program. I mean, it could be, but in our experience, or in my experience, at least with the colleges I've worked at, for undergraduate study in a lot of the disciplines like engineering, the popular ones, going into journal articles may not be the thing. But at the same time, what we went through today, we're not preparing students to read texts that are 4 sentences long. We're teaching them strategies on reading and processing. So hopefully they can take those strategies to longer, 5-6 page articles or whatever they need to read, and apply those strategies. And they'll struggle, as we do, reading those. But hopefully take those strategies to those texts.
I would go back to the example of this from Leo's smaller text, short text. And I think teaching them the ability to know what this is referring to is more powerful than getting intimidated by the length of a text or complexity of a text. I think it really comes down to as Andrew said, what are the strategies that they can use, and then build up from there. And I would argue that it's those smaller things. Find the beginning of the sentence, find the end of the sentence. What's the purpose of this sentence? Let's move on to the next one. Find the beginning, find the next. What's the purpose of this sentence?
Yeah. One of the questions that I posed in the chat is this idea that learners often struggle with difficult text. I think the reason why they struggle with difficult text is because teachers don't let their learners take risks with difficult text. For some reason, we're always protecting students from these more, oh no, this is too difficult. My students are not going to be able to handle that. How do you know? Why don't you let them struggle? I think the struggle is what really prepares them to what's going to come with the real language, right? And one of the things I added here is not so much complexity, Linda. I think it's a lack of familiarity with the genre. Students don't read enough. It goes back to what Sandra and Roberta said. They don't read. How can you expect them to be comfortable with a novel, with a journal, with a paper, if they don't read that? If, like, even in our program, like in our universities and colleges in Canada, our students are reading textbook sentence level structures, and they're going to college. Of course they're going to struggle in college because we're still coddling them, right? And one micro nugget that I have to add is to teach them what Mike said, this idea of referring to this, the function of that, text attack strategies. Have them attack the text. What does this refer to? What does it refer to here? Right? What's the noun phrase in this sentence? Okay. What is the connection between the first sentence and the second sentence? Oh, as Leandro said, in other words, what kind of information is going to follow? When you're teaching them these things, they're going to automatize these text attack strategies. So the next time you show them another text, you can go back to those same things and say, oh, see, we have more examples of this here. And one last point, which we didn't talk about here, but I'm working with a student. She's 16, fluent in English. She can speak, she can communicate, but for the life of me, this girl has absolutely no idea how to write. The other day she asked me, Leo, all her sentences are very much like my Spanish students. Sentence, comma, sentence, comma. And I said, do you even know why we use a comma? So I think even giving our students a very short text, remove all the punctuation have them put the punctuation back. That's a very simple activity that I think yields and unlocks so many learning opportunities, I should say, in a classroom setting. But again, we're not focusing on that, because what texts in the classroom are often doing, let's teach the present perfect, let's look at some vocabulary, move on. Next text. And that's the problem. That's the problem with the industry. And the training courses are not helping very much, because they're training, they're not educating. This is what Mike said in the beginning. We're all using the same comprehension approach. There's no coincidence. We have all been Pavloved.
That's a verb. I like it.
There's no coincidence.
Somewhat ironically, journal articles do usually follow a structure. So if students are aware of how they're structured with, and they usually have titles, whereas long, complex articles in the New York Times wouldn't. So at least they can tackle it one section at a time. An introduction, for example, maybe an abstract, maybe a background, maybe, and they, the language is more difficult and more challenging. But if they know the noun phrases and verb phrases, if they know that structure, if they know that in academic writing, we're talking about EAP a lot, but that it's a long noun phrase, the verb to be a long noun phrase, then they're not daunted by the volume of words that they're encountering versus, okay, well, this sentence has 24 words in it. Okay, but what is it? It's usually probably gonna be noun phrase, be noun phrase. So that's another way to look at it that way. So those strategies are transferable.
Yeah.
If a noun phrase is one word or a noun phrase is 10 words, taking that strategy to whatever genre they're looking at.
And just to add to Andrew, and I think Mike has an activity that he's designed for this session, but we said, Mike, we're not going to have time to do two, because we never have time for anything. Our sessions are always too long. We always aim for, we said, let's do 30 minutes, but it always ends up being 2 hours, because there's so much we can unlock. It's scripts. We don't teach our students scripts. Like when you're telling a story has a script. In every language, when you're telling a story in Portuguese, when you're telling a story in Spanish, there's often a script that we follow. A good example of a script would be, I had a good friend of mine, Spanish, has a C1, has a CPE proficiency, knows a lot of English, but when he was in Canada and I asked him to order a pizza over the phone, he couldn't do it. Why? Because the script of ordering a pizza in Spanish is very different from the script of ordering a pizza in English, right? So we're not looking at these macro and micro structures of the language. There's so much more. He didn't get anything, Andrew. At one point, he's just like, Leo, can you order? I'm like, dude, you're a C2. You should know how to do this.
That's funny, because when I was living in Costa Rica, my Spanish had improved a lot, and I was reading more, or trying to read novels and reading more books, and a friend was helping me, and she had me read aloud with her, and she was like, okay, you're pronouncing the words fine and you understand it, but you're reading Spanish in English. You're not reading Spanish in Spanish, because the cadence is different, the rhythm is different, the flow is different. So I think, going back to the question about, not necessarily in academic text, but in novels or creative writing, this is perhaps an insurmountable challenge without just doing it every day for years, because I have no guidance on how to teach students how to read creative works other than just having them read a book that they've already read in their L1, because you know the story and then you can kind of follow it along. And that's what I did. I read Spanish books that I've already read in English, and that helped me a lot. But structures and that stuff in Harry Potter, it's a lot more difficult, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Any more comments?
I think Linda said she had a question.
Yeah, I actually found conversation. The writers there, well, we're teaching that and, for example, is the connector, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of writers there start their sentences with and. So I really don't know how to reason things like that for my students, because I heard that that's allowed, but at the same time, that shouldn't happen in a text. Like, well-written text should not have and at the beginning of a sentence. It's just like a whole thing that's one of the things that students ask about, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also, two things are happening there, I think, and I'm going to get a little political here, so I apologize. I think One is that you're right, that we have to actually, and this goes back to Leo's little comment in the chat about exposure. The way to answer that question is to look at exposure. So we can look at what's normal for a particular genre. I would argue that in academic writing, if we were to look at 100 papers, we would probably notice and is typically in the middle, and that's the kind of advice we would guide them towards. Having said that, the political side is what we call native speaker privilege. So it's okay for me to use and at the beginning of the sentence when I write, but it's not okay for a student to do it because that's bad English. So we have to also be aware as teachers of, you know, what's happening here. And I would go back to evidence-based, and I think evidence-based would tell us, let's give them 5 copies of 5 different journal articles, and let's see how most of those sentences start. As Leandra's pointed out, how do they start when there's a connecting word at the beginning? What do we notice about those connecting words? They're typically adverbials. Why aren't they fanboys? Let's go back and look at the rule. Fanboys are typically used in the middle. So that type of, again, guided discovery. But you're right. Do teachers have access to 5 copies of journal articles? No, but there you go. That's what a learning center should have. That should be in the toolbox of your language school. 5 journal articles that you can use willy-nilly, or sorry, whenever you need them, for teachers to analyze and for students to analyze. But I do think that there is this idea of native speaker privilege, and that has to be brought up. And so if a student uses, I think, here, let me give you an example from my classroom, Linda. I had a student who was always writing because when. And I said, I tried to guide them. I said, well, let's look at some examples of some academic papers and see if we can find evidence of because when. And we couldn't. But the truth is, we can say that. We can say because when. So there's this element of, it's okay for me to say, because when you do this, I get really pissed off. So why is it okay for me to say that and for me to write that, but I have to correct a student when it has nothing to do with how I interpret their sentence? In fact, their sentence is 100% accurate. But again, it goes back to, in academic writing, that would not be an accepted norm. But we as teachers have to balance that. I have to check my own bias. I can't be right just because I'm white and speak English as my first language. They can also, right? Like that's not an answer. That's
one thing I want to add to what Mike said is I also think that a lot of the materials that have been designed, a lot of the English that is still being taught is very much written English. And we transfer a lot of this written English into spoken English. And 2 completely different beasts. Spoken English and written English are 2 completely different Englishes. And for some reason, a lot of the language, a lot of the rules, a lot of the published materials are still emphasizing written English. And the fact of the matter is, spoken English, we only use 3 or 4 connectors. But, and, so, then. But, and, so, then. As a matter of fact, I recorded my kids. I was having a conversation with them, and I wanted to prove to them, because the teacher was like, you have to use more even though when you speak. Nobody uses even though when they speak. It's too complex. It's too complex. Why? Because when you're speaking, it's very spontaneous. You can't plan ahead. It goes back to alignment. You're trying to align with your speaker, your interlocutor. If Mike uses even though, then I will be primed to use even though, because what he's basically saying is he's raising the bar and I want to be at his level. Right?
Get up a notch. Yeah.
But I think Mike is right about this whole native speakerism. And I think
time that I'm taller than you.
I've seen a lot of native speakerism on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube. Oh, speak like a native speaker. Speak like a native speaker. We don't want to see that. If you see that, report it. We're going after those people.
Even if you read books from famous authors, I just finished one by George Orwell about how to write, how he wrote, and Stephen King has one as well. Even those guys are saying you don't need all of those fancy words. You sound pretentious. Just talk like a normal person. Like just speak, right? as we're like expounding through this, I'm having like flashbacks because it is, maybe it all does, I don't know, maybe it all just comes back to genre, because I used to write for a newspaper and my editor would say to me, Andrew, you got to get rid of the passive voice. No passive voice. No passive voice. And it came to the point where he was like, okay. And he would make me go through every article that I submitted. And he's like, I'm not publishing anything else. Your total of passive structures can be 0. That's the maximum, 0. And I would have to take them all out and make them active and rework them. Because you don't do that in opinion pieces. You have no passive voice in published journalistic materials, because tell me what can be considered. Tell me what you think. I think this. Not that people can consider.
Very interesting.
What do you think? But as we know, in academic genres, passive is very common and is a really good use of language. So I don't know, off the top of my head, maybe it does come down to genre. I don't know.
Just a couple more points, actually. One talking about, so genre, Ken Hyland gave a really good presentation. Ken Hyland's this big kind of EAP guru. And it was a mixed method study. He looked at occasions of when students used I in academic writing and occasions of when academics use I. Academics use it more often than their students, but their students are told not to use it. Right? So
that's great.
It's very interesting. So that's the genre analysis side. The other thing is, I think a good way to handle this, and this thing I think is not just EAP. This goes back to your if you're teaching English as a foreign language or English to high school students, it goes back to Tarzan. So how do the students see themselves using the language? Do they want to get by with the ability to speak bluntly and to sound cool and to know slang and hip hop and to know a rap song and they be able to talk about that rap song using slang and colloquial English? If that's fine, then that's what we shape. That's what we help create. If they want to enter university, then they're going to not look like Tarzan. They're going to look like a more refined individual who uses things like adverbials and conjunctive adverbs conjunctive coordinators, subjunctive coordinators instead of fanboys at the beginning of their sentence.
Right.
My point being that this idea of Tarzan is, how do they envision themselves using English in the future? And that should determine, as Leo said, and we brought up many times in this presentation, that will determine the language they choose. Right. If that's all we do, then that's awesome.
I was once listening to this podcast by some writer, and he was saying that nobody would read a book if you write it in a language that doesn't appeal to your readers, right?
That's right. Yeah. What's the community you're trying to join? Where? Yeah. But that again goes. This is why we talk about language education and not language teaching, because language teaching never addresses those. They'll never get to that aspect. Language education addresses these larger issues around what does it mean to educate someone, and part of that is, most of it is the social dimension.
Yeah.
So then it could be also very interesting for all of us to, based on the genre, I guess, expose students to the differences and ask them, actually, part of needs analysis, what level do you want to get yourself into?
Sure.
I think Mike's point is interesting. Is the most important for all of us. Is you have to ask yourself, are you into language teaching or language education? I think we consider ourselves language educators. We're not really in the language teaching business, because the language teaching business is just a business with tests. If you really want to educate people, I think you have to look beyond that. And I think that's the most difficult question for a lot of people to answer. Do you remember, I want to give you guys, I don't like the word homework, so I'm going to reframe that into learning opportunities for the household. Do you remember that NPR, how little words affect the way do you remember that one? What was the name of that? I think that would be a very good podcast for everyone to listen to. There was a researcher. saying that because that's alignment too, Andrew? If you think about that,
Sure.
basically your little words, you align when you're talking to a person. So for example, if Sandra is sending an email to Roberta, she's going to say you. She's going to use a lot more you. Roberta, you have to do this because Sandra perceives herself to be above Roberta. But if Roberta is writing a message to her professor, she's going to say, I think that I could meet you at this time. So you change the language, going back to Mike's Tarzan analogy. You change the language depending on who you're talking to. So you use more you when you're talking to someone who is below you, and you use more. Oh, Andrew added that. That's a wonderful. That is how little words can reveal hidden interests. That's a very good one for everyone to. Maybe, Andrew, add that to the Google Classroom. I think that would be a good one for teachers to listen to.
Interesting.
Oh, so I mean, guys, we could go on for hours. Trust me. Like
Language
you're talking
too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like this is a finite thing. If you read
Yeah.
like what's Oscar Wilde or something, like no one writes like that now. So
yeah.
it changes.
Yeah. Anyway.
Good talk. Really good talk.
Good. I'll
Sandra,
stop
Roberto. Yeah, anyone, if you guys have any more, I think we can wrap it up. My kids are complaining that they're hungry now.